We are here at Google headquarters. Myself, I'm David Edelstein. My colleague Bilge Ebiri, calling in from the great state of Florida. Where are you exactly, Bilge, in Florida?
I am in Naples, Florida.
Naples, Florida, on the beautiful Gulf Coast. Hell of a time to be there, July 1st.
It's kind of hot.
And we've taken some questions in advance, but feel free to send them along, as well as your comments. Try not to be harsh. We don't have any makeup people here. I usually on CBS have this whole crew dedicated to making me look a hell of a lot better than I normally do. But here you just see film critics in the raw, which is a terrifying thought. All right, so the first question I think is a rather interesting one. It's from James Smith, so-called. I would love to hear what your critics, meaning me and Bilge, on the importance or lack thereof of theme in the success and popularity of today's movies. For example, it seems although recent superhero films feature big action, they also feature overt theming. I didn't know that was a word, but it's a useful one. And I wonder if that is a factor in their popular appeal. Bilge, let me put this to you. I think we've all noticed that even though theoretically many people believe that the superhero universe could exist with the dumbest imaginable scripts, there are actually a fair number of serious writers, including some very serious novelists, who are trying to inject pretty major themes in these movies. I mean, all you have to do is look at you don't just have to look at the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy, which wore its theming very broadly and dealt with very, very deep issues of vigilantism and social justice, coming down, I think, a little bit on the side of fascism, though I may be overreading. But the Avengers movies as well have all been heavily themed, and in fact, one of the best paranoid conspiracy thrillers of the last certainly 20 years was the Captain America sequel, The Winter Soldier, which very explicitly dealt with the idea of drone surveillance and the sort of the new drone surveillance state. So how much do you think, Bilge, these are factors in the success of these films? Do you think this is what really wins the hearts and minds of what I often think of as the comic communists?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's this whole issue of, we obviously know that the films do have themes. The question is how much of it relates to their success. When I think of superhero movies and themes, in some ways I feel like the superhero movie was dragged kicking and screaming into the world of themes by a number of factors. I mean, there was certainly, I think, Bryan Singer's X-Men movies. I mean, if you look at a film like X-Men or X-Men 2,
especially X-Men 2,
yeah, especially
with a very explicit gay subtext.
Exactly, and I think he made that very overt. And now, whether that was the reason for the film's success, we can't say for sure. But that is definitely something that a lot of critics and a lot of serious moviegoers seized on. But then, the other one I think of is, I have a poster that Sony sent me in, I think it must have been early 2001, of it was an advanced poster for Spider-Man, and you might remember this poster, David. It's a close-up of Spider-Man, and in his eyes you can see the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers reflected. Obviously this was early 2001, and after September 11th they had to kind of...
They reshot a ton of it, yeah.
Yeah, well, and then they got rid of that poster as well, which I was hoping the poster would be worth something today, but it's not. But if you think about it... It's not? But if you think about it, after an event like that, the idea of superheroes running around places that are very often either New York or modeled after New York, there is a subtext there regardless of whether the filmmaker brings it in or not. And I think to a certain extent filmmakers have to deal with that. And sometimes they deal with it in interesting ways. I mean, Spider-Man 1 didn't really deal with it. It kind of had to, it had already been shot for the most part. But Spider-Man 2 dealt with the legacy of September 11th in a very interesting way. I think the Dark Knight movie.
Tell me how. Remind me how.
Well, there's that scene, if you remember, Spider-Man 2 becomes very much about New York and the people of New York as this character. And if you remember that scene on the subway, there's no scene that recalls September 11th specifically, but the scene on the subway when Spider-Man...
The great subway scene where they pull off his mask and say he's just a boy.
He's just a boy. Yeah. And then they all kind of lift him up, and there's this sense of the city kind of uniting to help this figure, which is a kind of, I mean, if you think about it, pre-September 11th, you never saw movies about the people of New York coming together. It was just not a thing that you ever saw. It was not something we did. But after September 11th, it became a thing, and you see it in when they rebooted Spider-Man, the first one, not the second one.
Please don't use reboot without putting it in quotation marks.
Reboot. When they rebooted it.
We cannot use franchise, reboot, tentpole, or any of this crap without putting it in quotation marks because we're critics, damn it.
That's right. But no, in the Mark Webb Spider-Man, you saw that scene where I think it was the cranes all lifted and helped Spider-Man along. Mm-hmm. So there is always the sense of the city coming together, and I think that was really added. That was something that emerged in the wake of September 11th, and that's kind of a theme.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is very interesting. I cannot believe that we're such geeks that we can actually refer to these films in terms of their directors and their themes as well as everything else. But I think certainly it does make me long a bit for the days when the theme was oh hi.
There's my son. He doesn't realize that he's on with like potentially hundreds and thousands of viewers right now.
You see, I was thinking about his future college career when I was thinking that poster really isn't worth a lot of money with the
that poster is not. Although we could actually ask him about superhero movies, I'm sure he'll have lots of insight.
Probably much more intelligent things than we do. But what I did want to say though was that I do sometimes long for the days of a more simpler of a superhero movie in which the superhero is not carrying the weight of the world on his or hopefully someday her shoulders. I remember meeting Tim Burton when Beetlejuice came out. I was doing an interview with him for Rolling Stone, and we met in New Orleans of all places, and he was going off to shoot Batman, and he said they were getting a little more real with it. His idea, and Sam Hamm, the original screenwriter's idea, was to do Batman as a kind of depressive addict, a man who was kind of addicted to his own pain, and from that pain fashioned this superhero persona and became a prisoner of it, and it was sort of two freaks fighting each other, and Burton was really high on doing something psychologically a little more real, but that and I think that's about the level at which I'm comfortable with it. When you start to insert a lot more allegorical stuff, and you take it to the level that you and I differ on Christopher Nolan, but when you take it to the level that Nolan did, I kind of think the theminess, what did he say, theming, at a certain point upstages, the really cool action. But that's just me.
I think you're right. I mean, look, I'm a avowed huge fan of Christopher Nolan, but I'm not a big fan of his legacy, because what happens is, and that's one of the things about themes and about these kind of dark, portentous reboots of superhero movies, what you see is it becomes commodified. I mean, I think Nolan's films were interesting and very sincere in the way they approached them, but because they made so much money, now we're getting a lot of imitators, and we're getting a lot of people who kind of wear the trappings of themes and import and these kind of pseudo Dostoevskian aspects.
Would Dostoevsky be writing Batman scripts right now? It's quite possible.
He had a lot of debt. He had a lot of debt. In the age of internet gambling, who knows how much money he would owe people.
Well, I mean, I think that obviously Dostoevsky and Notes from Underground gave us Travis Bickle via Paul Schrader, and it's interesting to think whether it might not have given us Batman as well via Christopher Nolan, but let's not go there. I'm just looking on the side of my screen here and seeing some of these questions. I'm just going to throw them out. What are the differences between what you see at festivals and the finished product, if you will? Do you see mostly positive changes, or has any film ever worsened with more editing? Bilge, you probably go to more festivals than I have. I can't recall I guess I see films late enough in the process now that I can't recall too many instances of studios mangling films or improving films. I can tell you I was lucky enough once upon a time, many years ago, to see a film called Vampire's Kiss, starring Nicolas Cage, before the studio hacked it down. I think they lost about 15 or 20 minutes of it, and it was really wonderful. I mean, I think it's still a pretty wonderful film, but there was a lot more of a relationship between this guy who thought he was a vampire and his therapist. It was a lot more anchored in, I guess, what our previous questioner would call theminess or theming. And it was absolutely wonderful and made a lot more sense than what I saw on the finished screen. We also know about the mangling of Once Upon a Time in America, which was then restored, and I gather has been restored again. But have you seen, in recent times, any films that have undergone that kind of shift?
In terms of films that, I mean, I've definitely seen films that have changed from the festival cut to the release cut. In recent years, I haven't seen anything that jumps out at me as having been ruined from festival to release. In some cases, it's been improved. I hate to ever admit that a distributor's cuts help the movie, but I mean, you and I have discussed this. Donnie Darko is a great example of the Sundance cut of Donnie Darko. The extended cut is a catastrophe, and the theatrical release cut, which admittedly made no money, is one of the greatest debuts I've ever seen.
I agree, and the reason is because everything that was sort of wonderfully suggestive in the cut Donnie Darko, that left room for the film to be seen as a kind of metaphor for teen angst and also a savior fantasy, became a savior fantasy. And I mean, all the wonderful ambivalence and the gray areas that we brought to it became pinned down to the point where it became really, I thought, kind of insulting. I mean, I kind of rolled my eyes at the cut. I have to say, I also feel the same way about Apocalypse Now in the recut version, which I think is idiotic. I don't think the old one is a perfect film by any means, but I think that was a case of Coppola having to seeing how the movie tested and seeing what would play and going with his showman instincts. And then later on, when everybody told him what a masterpiece it was, he bloated it up again with a lot of the stuff that he sensibly lost.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why maybe we don't, and I'm speaking out my butt here, but one of the reasons why we probably don't see a lot of these, I mean, because we saw this all the time, or not we saw this, but like film history is full of examples of films that premiered at Cannes or wherever, and then.
Oh my God! Can I just interrupt you for a second? Yeah, I just introduced Orson Welles Month on Turner Classic Movies, and looking back and seeing the original script of The Magnificent Ambersons and reading, which might have been one of the greatest American. Some people still think it is one of the greatest American films, but what it might have been had it not lost half an hour or more and been reshot, based on a preview in Pomona, California, after some sort of crazy dance movie, that the audience turned on this movie. And Wells, of course, was off in South America filming a disastrous quasi-documentary that never got finished. And so the studio and Robert Wise was brought on, just ripped this movie to shreds. So yes, cinema history is full of these examples of mutilated movies.
Yeah, and even more recent cinema. I mean, you pointed out, Once Upon a Time in America. We have the example of Brazil. A lot of films, but I think in recent years, and we can define recently however we want there. But in recent years, I think because of things like the internet and social media, it's a little harder for somebody to do that, because I think what you'll wind up with is an outcry. I mean, if a film opens at Cannes and you have hundreds of people talking about it, and everybody's excited about it, and then the distributor comes in and cuts an hour out or something, especially if people were ecstatic about it, you're going to hear about it. We're going to hear about it. It's going to be a thing.
The director's cut is a convention now, too.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can, I mean, and people say that Terrence Malick has enough footage to create an entirely new Tree of Life, and I can understand that, because to me, you know, he shoots everything. He's been compared to a guy with a butterfly net. He gets all these images, and then he gets this huge number of editors and spends a long time kind of stitching them together. But that's not to say that he couldn't take the same images or entirely different ones and stitch together something else. Yeah. It's not a man who storyboards. But let's jump on to the next question. How do you experience movies? This is from Matthew, is it Katie O'Hara or Matthew Orlando? Or Carrie O'Hara, I'm sorry. Well, one of them says, how do you experience movies differently as a critic than as a regular viewer? What's that process like? Well, I can just say very briefly, and I know this sounds pretentious, but if I weren't pretentious, I wouldn't be a critic. There is something that we call the dual mind of the critic, which means that I have cultivated this high spiritual awareness, whereas I'm able to watch a film and at the same time stand a little bit back and watch myself watching the film. So I'm in a way sort of trying to understand my own responses as I watch something and trying to get them down. And people say, well, doesn't that interfere with your primary enjoyment? My answer is no. I'm probably have a lot of Talmudic rabbis in my past, and I enjoy hashing this stuff out, going over it, pulling this stuff apart, and that really turns me on. And so I love thinking about movies that way, and it doesn't mean that I don't love trashy movies. I love them probably even more than most people, because I think about them obsessively. Bilge, I suspect you have a lot of the same things going on inside that head of yours.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of it as being different modes. I mean, I feel like I was always thinking about movies critically on some level. And also, I mean, I went to school for filmmaking, and I worked on film sets, and I made a film years ago. So there's also, and I remember when after my first film class, I went to a Martin Scorsese retrospective, and I'd seen the films before, but I remember watching Raging Bull again and being completely distracted because I was so focused on the lighting and all the cutting. It was like suddenly I found myself incapable of. So in some ways, seeing movies as a filmmaker is almost harder than to see them as a critic. True. But at the same time, I think, I think if you're not thinking of films in a critical way, you probably wouldn't ever want to be a film critic to begin with. I think it's just kind of...
Or a Vulture Insider, for that.
Exactly. But, are there movies... There is this, though. I'll often go see... I review a lot of the animated films that come out. In part because I have a 6-year-old son who likes to go to these things. But I definitely, if I'm with him, I see the movie very differently than if I'm just by myself. And a recent example of this is a film like Walking with Dinosaurs. I shouldn't even admit this, but I saw Walking with Dinosaurs and I panned it in the pages of Vulture. I saw it, like a Thursday night screening. I went by myself. I think I was like the one person in the theater. I scribbled all my notes. I was really mean to the movie. All these the poop jokes and the narration that didn't work and the mouths that didn't match on the dinosaurs. It seemed like a mess, and I said so in my review. That weekend, or possibly the weekend after, went to see it with my son. Completely different experience. I mean, it became...
Okay, you have to write this.
Yeah.
You're sharing it with us now, but you should write about this too.
I mean, he and I were both in tears watching the thing. We went and saw it like 3 or 4 more times.
You're discrediting our whole profession here now, if it's that dependent on place and who you're with. But I certainly think it's true that when you have kids, and I do, they're older than yours, you do relearn. I mean, you relearn the language that you speak through as watching them acquire language, but I also relearn movies. I remember taking Lucy when she was 3. She's now 17 and in Tanzania. Hi, Lucy, if you're watching. I doubt it. we saw, I think it was the Tigger movie or something. That was like one of her first movies, and might have been her first movie. And she, after 20 minutes, she looked at me and she said, "Turn it off." And I said, "Well, I can't turn it off. It's a bit," and the kineticism of the movie, the kinetic, the camera moving and the sound and everything else was so violent for her, having never been to a movie before. The cutting and all the things that we respond to as grown-up sort of sensation mongers, people looking for a great amusement park ride, really frightened her back into Mr. Rogers and his cool long shots of him taking off his shoes and putting on his sneakers, and I began to look at movies, at more kinetic movies, in a slightly more different and maybe more exacting way. I mean, if you're gonna bounce me around like this, if you're gonna bludgeon me, you sure as hell better have a good reason for doing it, and it's not just, you know, what Pauline Kael once called jolts for jocks, which he was afraid that movies were turning into. That was 71. I think they pretty well turned into that by now, for the most part.
Yeah.
Let me see what else we have. Okay, have either of you ever tried attending a film festival without credentials? If so, any tricks for tricks for getting the most film bang for your buck? Well, I don't know about you, Bilge. What I usually do is, if I get stopped from going into a screening, I say, "Do you know who I am?" And they say, "No, who are you?" And I say, "Nobody, never mind," and I walk away. But have you attended many festivals as a civilian, and been turned away?
I've been to I've in New York, definitely. I mean, before I was a critic, I used to try and go to the New York Film Festival, which of course famously sells out within a day. And I remember waiting in many lines for movies that, in some cases, I didn't get into. You know, those standby lines, or standing outside with a sign, or trying to find somebody who has a ticket they might give you. You know, some very heartbreaking near misses for me with films I didn't get into, and also some situations where I waited in line for an hour and a half to get into a movie, and then hated the movie. And just the amount of disappointment I felt, and the anger I felt. I mean, the anger you feel at a movie that you don't like after waiting like an hour, 2 hours to get into it is significantly different from, you know, whether you just bought a ticket online and waltzed right in.
But in a film festival, aren't you really pulling from? Don't you find that one of the wonderful things about film festivals, and I go to the big ones and I go to a lot of small ones too, in places like Sarasota or the Berkshires, or you just find this sense of community that you lack the rest of the time that you go see movies, or certainly when you watch them at home. This wonderful sense of community. Everybody, sometimes the filmmakers there, people are pulling for the movie. Maybe they're rating it afterwards. They get little cards nowadays, because everything has to end with a prize. I mean, to me, a lot of movies look better at film festivals than they do just on a commercial screen. And why not? Why not do things that build communities and help filmmakers, many of whom are not making the kind of living that, you know, the guys who run Pixar or Marvel are?
I think, I mean, and those small, like, kind of small town film festivals, or these kind of smaller regional festivals, those are a wonderful thing. I mean, you have, in a lot of cases, you'll have these festivals that are in, you know, kind of metropolitan hubs, and that's kind of their big international film festival, and they bring in kind of the Cannes movies and whatnot. But then these regional festivals will often feature small independent movies. They're not great movies necessarily, but they're always very interesting. The filmmakers are usually there. They're very engaged. I'm a big fan of those, not the least because I took my film around to a lot of films like that, festivals like that back in the day.
When can we see your film, Bilge?
It's on Netflix.
It is?
Or it was. I think it was for a long time.
What's it called?
It's called New Guy.
New Guy. Okay. I feel ashamed of myself that I've never seen it.
I'll give you a DVD.
Okay.
But I was going to say, I mean, one thing about film festivals is, you know, each festival has its own ethos and its own logic, really. I mean, something like the New York Film Festival obviously is it's a big deal. There are a lot of big titles coming out of Cannes, but there's also the chance that a lot of those films are going to come out eventually. But what makes New York Film Festival special is you get to see them on a big screen, like Alice Tully. I mean, a film like Timbuktu, which is one of my favorite films of the year. I don't know where it played when it actually played theaters in New York, but I don't think it played anything the size of Alice Tully Hall.
I mean, the sad thing is, yeah, that it might have played the Angelica here, which are these little sort of tiny little railroad car screens and theaters, and even the Film Forum, which would win my vote as one of the best theaters in the country, if not the world, is not the greatest place to experience a film of visual splendor. So it is. You're right. I hope we don't lose the Ziegfeld.
No, definitely not. I mean, I think that's the thing with film festivals for me, is that if they're being held in a great venue, don't just look at the film, but look at also the screen that you're seeing it on, and see if that's an opportunity to see something that you otherwise might not get to see on a big screen. I think the other thing is like a film festival like Tribeca. Now, Tribeca is a film festival I cover, but I also attended. I mean, if there's a film that I didn't catch beforehand or didn't get a screener of, didn't get into a screening of, I work in and around that area. Very often the screenings don't sell out.
Right.
And I like being able to just kind of buy a ticket and go in.
I bullied my way into Zombievers last year, which I think was kind of a mistake. But because once I bullied my way in and got one of the last seats, I couldn't leave after 5 minutes. So so I saw Zombievers. Let me just jump to a question. Is the iPhone the new 16 millimeter? See Tangerine. Well, I don't know if my review of Tangerine is online yet. It's in New York Magazine. It's a film I adore. You've seen it too, right, Bilge?
Yeah.
Now, it is the thing about the iPhone is they also used. It's not just the iPhone. I mean, they have special anamorphic lenses, and there are. And they have. It wasn't, and there's a lot of post-production finesse going on. But I don't think it's the new 16 millimeter, but it's certainly the new digital. Right? I mean, it can be the new high def with the right accoutrement.
Yeah, and I think in an age when I saw Tangerine at Sundance, but I actually saw it off a screener at Sundance because I couldn't make it into one of the screenings. And I mean, it looked great on my computer screen, but of course, in an age when we've got when people are more and more experiencing films on smaller screens, the iPhone absolutely can be the new 16 millimeter. I mean, digital technology obviously already is the new 16 millimeter, and the iPhone camera is a good camera. I think that, like you said, David, I mean, it's really about the other things you bring to it and also how you use it. I mean, not every movie is going to work shot that way.
I think this film had a very, very good combination of the kinds of shots you would expect, in which he sort of was chasing after the characters behind them on the street as they were hurrying down the sidewalk. But it also had a fair number of very elegantly composed shots that you could tell it wasn't all this sort of swervy, jittery documentary realism. There were a lot of stationary, beautifully lit, beautifully composed shots. And I think it was the combination. The film certainly felt loose, but there was a ton of filmmaking ingenuity in there and a lot of artistry. So I couldn't just pick up an iPhone and make a movie. But
I think, and also, I mean, let's also not forget that celluloid is still a wonderful thing. And
love celluloid.
I mean, 16 millimeter, like the iPhone can be the new 16 millimeter to a certain extent, but I hope that 16 millimeter to some extent continues to be 16 millimeter, because it's as wonderful as new technology has been in enabling filmmakers. I really hope that we don't lose the pictorial quality of celluloid and that tradition of filmmaking as well, and I don't think we will. There are too many people who come of age watching movies like Lawrence of Arabia or whatever, insert your favorite epic here, that you know, those people and viewers like me who love that type of work will still want to see
The influence,
films
I think the influence of people like Terrence Malick might even become more profound as television does long-form narrative so much better than movies, for the most part. These are generalizations. For the most part, than movies do. Movies might have to ask themselves more and more, filmmakers, what makes a movie cinematic? What is a cinema experience versus a narrative television experience? It was very interesting that David Chase, when he made his autobiographical rock and roll film, was asked at a press conference I was at, why did you ever think of doing this as a TV series? And he said, no. He didn't. It was non-narrative. There's a lot of music, a lot of atmosphere. I mean, it was actually narratively a little slack. But the point is that he found, a man who helped to usher in an age of new, sophisticated narrative storytelling on television, had a different idea of what a movie feels like and looks like and how an audience experiences it. And I found that very interesting, that there is a connection between the syntax, between the language of a film and where it's exhibited, the circumstances under which it's exhibited. Question, are there any films you saw in your youth that you have found deeper meaning in as you gathered more and more life experience? Well, it's a very interesting question. I can say that I came of age, I was a real little prick of an adolescent, and overweight and nerdy, just exactly what you'd expect if you've ever read me. And horror movies really kind of helped me get through my, fear of women and my feelings of being an outsider. This is horror movies before they were real, before people made them for $200 million, when they were, the Hammer films, which were made very cheaply, and the Universal horror films, and all sorts of things that were on Chiller Theater. And gradually, as I got older and I began actually to be involved with flesh and blood women and to have so-called adult relationships, I discovered that some of those films, especially the Hammer ones, that really saved me as an adolescent, were also incredibly sexist, reactionary, regressive, horrible. And part of my, coming to terms, to sort of come to terms with myself, I had to come to terms with the messages that were in them. So I kind of had to go back and look at the fear of female sexuality and female independence and the attitudes, the racial attitude, the attitudes of class and race that those movies expressed, and kind of work my way through them and become, I hope at the end of it, a more whole person. Now, do I still love Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee? Well, oh yes. Yes, Boris Karloff, the late Patrick Macnee, who just died, was my first favorite actor, and The Avengers is full of weird psychosexual stuff. And then Boris Karloff, then Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. I don't necessarily feel the same way about those films that I do, that I did at the time, but I still relish them, and I love going back and seeing, how I became who I am.
Yeah. I think that's I think that can apply to a lot of genre movies if you think about it. I mean, I wasn't as big a horror fiend growing up, but I was a big fan of spaghetti westerns. And spaghetti westerns often have a lot of the same dynamics. At the same time, in a lot of cases, they were being made by frustrated Marxist documentarians, and I mean, they were being made in the Italian political context.
We learned capitalism through the Italians, or a certain vision of capitalism.
Exactly, but then you look at these films. I mean, as I got older, I looked at spaghetti westerns, and I noticed all these really, these very critical themes in them. A lot of them were very left-leaning. Sergio Leone films are basically
they're Marxist
tracts. They're Marxist allegories, which is great because they star Clint Eastwood. How fantastic is that? I mean, the movies that helped make Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson and all these people were actually made by communists. But I think that's one example where, as I got older, films that I'd seen in my youth changed, and I started to see them through a different prism. I do think there are also certain films that I find grow with you. And I mean, one of my favorite films, one of my absolute favorite films of all time, is Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, which I didn't see it as when I was too young. I saw it in my freshman year of college, and it blew me away immediately. But the parts that I fixated on at the time were the early scenes of Barry falling in love with a girl who kind of shuns him or leads him along. And those were the scenes that, as a freshman in college, that was the stuff that I seized on. And then, but then as I've gotten older, as I've kind of had a family and a kid and things like that, I seize on the other parts of the movie. And as I go through my life, I find myself going through that character's life and being more interested in different parts of that story. Now, that's because of the nature of that story. I mean, a movie that takes, that takes the swath of somebody's life, you're going to relate to different parts of it as you get older, obviously.
Yeah. I would agree about Barry Lyndon, actually. That and Dr. Strangelove may end up being the peaks in what was a peak-filled career by Kubrick. I think another film that works for me that way is The Lady Eve. It is my favorite film. It's a film that when I saw in college as a specimen of the genre of remarriage, so-called by a professor of mine, Stanley Cavell, I thought it was very, very, very clever and certainly had some depth to it. But when I began to live in my imagination the life of the main character, and I also began to realize just how genius, how sophisticated Preston Sturges's understanding of love, of the human condition and love and all the, I think this is an endlessly profound film that is still a laugh riot. I saw it with an audience last Valentine's Day at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and it was fresher than any romantic comedy I had seen in the previous 2 decades. It really is, as deep in its way as Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, but it does not wear its depths quite the way Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind does. It's just a masterpiece. And I would think that's true of a handful of other Preston Sturges films as well. Let's just talk a little before we wrap things up about what's out there now, what everybody should be looking forward to. You and I are paying a lot of attention to documentaries this week. It's an extraordinary time right now for documentaries with The Wolfpack on the screen, the Amy Winehouse documentary opening this week, Stray Dog, Deborah Granick's documentary, which follows Winter's Bone, her last film. There are a host of other Cartel Land. Which of these films are you most excited about?
Well, I'm a big fan of Cartel Land and Stray Dog. I actually haven't seen Amy, so I'm actually most excited about Amy because I've heard so many great things about it.
It's a fascinating. If those of you who haven't, most of you haven't seen it, it's a fascinating movie. It raises the question that all similar documentaries do about self-destructive artists. Are we looking at a post-mortem, or are we looking at a profile? Is it an autopsy? How much of what we see is colored by what we know that the ending was, and how much time does the filmmaker spend on what we would say is the more sensational or ghoulish aspects of the story? In this case, since Amy Winehouse's talent was, her beginnings and her ends were so, woven together, I think the filmmaker gets away with a lot of, autopsy stuff, and along the way really illuminates her lyric writing and her singing in a way that I didn't think was possible. She does have one of the great voices of certainly the last 50 years, and the movie answered many of my questions, if not all of them, of where that voice came from, where that soul came from.
I think, and that's interesting because Asif Kapadia, the filmmaker, his previous film, I don't know if this was his previous film, but he also made Senna, the documentary about Ayrton Senna. But before that, I believe he was a fiction filmmaker, and not a particularly good one, as I recall.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's really found his calling with these documentaries. The other thing I was going to say was, I mean, you know, summer is one of those times when there's so much activity around blockbusters, and sometimes it's valuable. You know, I mean, a film like Inside Out or a film like Mad Max Fury Road. I mean, these are films that I think I'm glad people are focusing on them. But, you know, so much of the interest is fixated on those, and so much of the news is fixated on those, that a lot of really small movies come out and are kind of lost. You know, if they're, I mean, and you and I can talk at length about these films. I mean, I just saw Jimmy's Hall, the new Ken Loach film, which is wonderful. But I think that, you know, if there's one thing, you know, somebody who is a serious film goer can do
Or
during
even
the
a
summer.
playful, or even
Or playful, yeah, exactly. Serious sounds too pretentious.
I mean,
but
yeah, I mean, we can. It's important that we cover the blockbusters and that we write about them. We write about, first of all, they're using so much of Hollywood's resources right now that, I mean, it's important that we see what millions of people are, and there are things to say, obviously, certainly about movies like Inside Out, even about crap, you know, really good crap like Jurassic World. And I didn't love Mad Max, the new Mad Max, to the same degree you did, but a fascinating film on a lot of different levels. But there are also amazing documentaries out there now that are being, you know, that are doing new things for the form. You know, every time you turn around, someone has figured out a new way to tell a story, because the apparatus of filmmaking now, it's become so cheap compared to what it used to be, that people are really playing with the language of documentaries, and journalistic documentaries are artistic statements in all kinds of ways now, and vice versa as well. So I all I can say is that I think there's a lot of fun to be had, and a lot of huge emotions to be experienced watching some of these movies. I would say Cartel Land is wrenching. It's a profile of essentially vigilantism in the real world, in Mexico and at the U.S. in southern Mexico and the U.S.-Mexican border. I have a lot of issues with the film, but I think everybody should see it.
And it's as gripping as any studio blockbuster you're likely to see.
Absolutely,
as well, you know?
Absolutely. And Stray Dog is a very sad, creepy portrait of life in a, you know, of a life that has no conventional support systems. None of the things that we take for granted in the society that we're supposed to have are present in this man's life. I mean, it's a tragic film in a lot of ways.
Yeah, very much so. I'm working on my review of it as we speak. So
you're thinking your way through it, and
I'm trying to remember what you're saying now so that I can use it.
Okay, thank you. You're by permission. And the Wolfpack, which also, and this maybe returns to an earlier question, and we'll end with this. The Wolfpack is a film that. I have a friend who really hates it, and I can't wait to kind of get into it with her and find out why. But the thesis of the film is that there are these kids who were essentially this family of boys that was essentially imprisoned by their father, who seems to have been insane, you know, an insane megalomaniac, shut in, probably alcoholic, and their only way of experiencing the outside world, the real world, was via movies. And many movies like Tarantino or action blockbusters, violent blockbusters, even Friday the 13th and Halloween movies, you know, as a consequence of this, and I should say their mother's homeschooling, they seem to have emerged sort of shockingly, if not well-adjusted, then shockingly grounded. You know, they can go out into the real world and they could see a world that they didn't know existed, but they're not as disoriented as you think they would be. And so what it's saying is, I guess, in the way that horror movies kind of helped me, that even movies that some of us now worry about the impact that they're going to have on people of more impressionable ages, are learning that that even movies like this can teach people how to make the kind of imaginative leaps that are what makes us human, that what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom, and what has played a part in our evolution to the age of San Andreas and Jurassic World.
Yeah, and I think with the wolf pack especially, one of the reasons why I think some people aren't fans of that movie is, and I can see why, but I think the film is very smart about this. You know, it raises a lot of questions, which it doesn't necessarily answer. But that's okay, because, I mean, you know, there are questions of, you know, it doesn't necessarily go too far into kind of the you know, the child abuse aspect of kind of what's being done to these kids. But you know, at the same time, it goes into issues of loyalty. I mean, this family is very loyal, very close. These issues of, you know, the question of movie love, which you just talked about. I love the fact that there's a film out there that raises all these questions, goes some distance towards discussing them, but sort of lets them hang there. And I think as a documentary, that's a fascinating approach. I mean, I would love to see a series of the wolf pack, but at the same time, I love the fact that it's no, but I love the fact that it's this kind of very compact, very short documentary, and you walk out of it and you have hundreds of questions, and you have all these things you want to say, and I think that's a good thing. You know, I think that's I don't think the film should answer all these questions. I think it prompts you to discuss them, which is wonderful.
It's wonderful. A really great movie, a great work of art, is something that can make you say yes and no at the same time, and your inability to reconcile those two things is part of what makes something a profound and lasting work of art. I mean, if otherwise it would be an essay, right? It would be a prescription. Bilge, I am told that we are out of time. I just want to wish you a wonderful time in Florida and say I'm very proud to have you as a colleague and have enjoyed listening.
Me too.
And thank you, everybody, for those of you who've watched and sent in questions. I hope we've brightened your day a little bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you.